Pepsid Complete knows that food is one of the best parts of game day. That is, until heartburn strikes. Thankfully, just one chewable tablet of Pepsid Complete provides dual-action heartburn relief with an antacid that starts working instantly and an acid reducer that lasts all day. So you can stay focused on that second helping of chili without worrying about heartburn. All day based on 8-hour symptom relief studies during the day. Use product only as directed.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. The walls are closing in on Pope Gregory VII as 1074 came to a close. He had to change his fortunes, and they had to change quickly. He'd been in the game long enough to know that if you were standing still, you were already behind the competition. We start with the plot against the Pope, but the majority of the episode is one that I felt was absolutely necessary to our understanding of Gregory VII's impact on history. He would announce what is called the Dictatus Papae, or the dictates of the Pope, and they weren't powerful as merely words on paper. The power came off of the parchment they were written on. The power of these dictates came in what is at the heart of my approach to this entire podcast. It's called the Thomas Theorem, which states, if men define situations as real, then they are real in their consequences. Think about that a while we get started here. This is episode 124 entitled Dictatus Papae. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Over the next few months, the Roman aristocracy was in full swing in plotting against the Pope, and one of the most well-known weaknesses the mighty pontiff had was his relationship to the Tuscan nobility, namely Matilda, now in her late 20s and still married to Duke Godfrey III of Lorraine. There could be no greater spot to hit the man than this, especially given his recent reforms. Michelle K. Spike writes in her book Tuscan Countess, quote, bureaucracies are efficient purveyors of rumors, if nothing else. By October 1074, speculations about the Pope and the Countess were in full swing. End quote. Throughout the autumn of 1074, it seems the two Tuscan noblewomen met several times, each appeal to have them come to Rome, blanketed in the terms like, sisters and daughters of St. Peter, so as to cover his tracks just a bit. But by December, Gregory was desperate to re-legitimize his papacy, feeling the walls pressing in on all sides, so he did what Henry IV did a year earlier when he was feeling the pressure from Saxony. The roles were now completely reversed, you see. Gregory wrote Henry, asking to pledge soldiers and support to reignite the Pope's crusade into Anatolia to aid the Byzantines against the encroaching Turks. He even offered to lead the entire army himself, but it wasn't just left at that. Spike quotes Gregory's actual letter to the German king. It reads, quote, for it shall please God that I go. I shall leave the Roman Church, under God, in your hands, to guard her as a holy mother and to defend her for his honor. End quote. Did you catch that? Gregory offered to personally lead the army and leave King Henry IV in charge of not only Rome, but of the church itself. All of this made its way back to Constantinople with one additional detail. Pope Gregory VII, the Bishop of Rome, declared that he would also hold a synod in the imperial capital when he arrived. The Greek bishops and patriarchs were appalled at the notion that the Pope would dare even suggest such a thing, especially in the wake of the events of 1054 and the schism that was still being felt 2 decades later. It was unconscionable, as far as they were concerned, and they voiced their anger and fears to Emperor Michael VII Ducas. But the emperor was faced with his own fears at the Pope's declaration. Though he was asking for assistance against the Seljuk Turks, he was implying that it would still be a Byzantine-led army that arrived, just with Western mercenaries to bolster its numbers. What he never intended was for a Western army to be led by Western leaders, and for this Western force to remain Western when it arrived. That implied that Michael VII invited an invasion upon his empire, and that is not what he did. You see what was at stake in 1074? The entirety of the East-West balance, that's what. And Gregory was so dead set on this that he wrote a letter to Matilda expressing some deeply held feelings. Spike quotes from a letter written to her dated December 16, 1074, and it read this, quote, "And I, provided with such sisters, would most gladly cross the sea and place my life, if need be, at the service of Christ, with you, whom I hope to have forever at my side in our eternal home." End quote. See how he keeps cloaking all of these deep feelings in religious verbiage? Always referring to her as sister or daughter of St. Peter and whatnot. He was a very talented wordsmith, to say the very least. But what else is implied in this letter? Well, he's essentially offering to take Matilda with him to Constantinople. At least that's Spike's interpretation. She supports this with his words at the end of this same letter that reads, quote, "Pray send me word as soon as possible of your decision in this matter, and also of your coming to Rome." End quote. With the medieval world on the brink of a full-scale crusade, a full 20 years before the First Crusade would ever take place, what would Matilda choose? Would she leave her mother and accompany the Pope at the head of a monstrous Western army to take on the formidable Seljuk Turks way out in the Anatolian highlands? Or would she turn down the offer from the man she valued above all others and remain to govern Tuscany in the hopes that this man will one day return to her safely? Matilda wasted no time and spent the Christmas holiday through early spring in Rome, as the honored guest of the Pope, just to be sure. She stayed in the same palace as the Pope, too, in the Lateran Palace, which is no longer standing today. From 318 to 361, the Lateran Palace was the home of the Bishop of Rome, much to my surprise, actually. The Vatican wasn't the seat of the papacy until after the palace's second devastating fire in 60 years forced a change, this fire again occurring, as you can imagine, in 1361. So Matilda and Gregory VII spent their winter and early spring of 1075 together in the Lateran Palace in Rome, a period of time that Spike refers to as, quote-unquote, possibly the most important period of Gregory's papacy. Their relationship was once again in the spotlight in Rome, but they couldn't care less. One 11th century writer called her Inconsilius Astutissima, or his most astute counselor, glorifying her role in his life, and he even put similar words in writing himself. Matilda of Tuscany's ideas and thoughts were his most valued advice. He cherished this 28-year-old noblewoman far more than any other. Now, it was during this time in early 1075 when, with Matilda by his side, always by his side it seems, he developed, wrote, and released what became forever known as the Dictatus Papae, or the Dictates of the Pope. Unknown to me before reading the works of Michelle Spike and John Julius Norwich, I looked into these dictates further to see exactly what they said, because knowing what I already knew about Pope Gregory VII, I knew they must have been bold and relentless. This seems to me to be the cornerstone of what has come to be called the Gregorian reforms, a collective name encapsulating every single thing the man worked for throughout his entire career in the church. The Dictatus Papae are 27 simple sentences, numbered like a high school assignment, really, but each one amounts to a haymaker to the establishment. In Spike's words, quote, "At the second synod of his papacy, held in late February, with Matilda again seated among the secular leadership, Gregory decisively declared war against the lay interests of the world, by which the church had been chained until that moment and from which it had to be freed." End quote. Historian and author R.L. Wilkin, in his work entitled Gregory VII and the Politics of the Spirit, once called Gregory VII's 27 papal edicts, quote-unquote, "the first of the great revolutions of Western history." Now, those are not idle words, folks, and they strike at the very heart of why I began this podcast. Once again, I maintain that the nation I love dearly, the United States of America, was not founded in a vacuum. We Americans are unique, but we are not uniquely original. We truly stand on the shoulders of giants. Some of these giants were gentle. Some had gargantuan intellects. Some were small but mighty beyond words. And some were outright monsters. But I maintain that we are who we are because they were who they were. When I read this reference to Wilkin's work in Spike's biography of Matilda, I felt vindicated in my supposition that by understanding the people of the Middle Ages, I can begin to find a historical, intellectual, and even spiritual beginning to my home country. In fact, like a family tree, what our ancestors did radiates outward in innumerable branches, feeding each nation that Europe, for better or for worse, had touched up to this point. Here is the one point deep in our cultural family tree of Western civilization that we can point to as a basis for much of what the civilization came to be known for: the separation of church and state. Now, is it a pure representation of what we experience here in the States today, or really anywhere in the Western world? Absolutely not. Was this separation intended for the benefit of the layperson tending a field somewhere in Lincolnshire? Certainly not. But is it a step in that direction? I say yes. Let's take a look at these 27 edicts of Gregory's, 27 edicts that Matilda, his most astute counselor, assisted in writing. We'll take them slow so we can truly understand the power of each one. Now, number 1, that the Roman Church was founded by God alone. Now, that one seems to be pretty self-evident in its meaning. I've mentioned this before. As seen in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus once told his apostle Simon that he would be the rock upon which my church shall be built. Thus, Simon became Peter, or Saint Peter, who brought Jesus' teachings to Rome and was subsequently crucified upside down on the very site of St. Peter's Basilica, where that stands today. It was this deputization by the Son of God upon which Christians base this assertion, the assertion that the Roman Church was founded by God alone. Gregory was merely reiterating it. But if this was widely accepted as true, then why the need to say it again? I believe it sets the tone for the other 26. Establish your authority so it is harder to refute. Establish that your authority comes directly from God, and well, let's look at the next one. Number 2, that the Roman pontiff alone can, with right, be called universal. Now, what was I saying? Establish your authority coming directly from God, and no one can refute you without refuting God. And there is one word that really seals the deal when it comes to the Pope's unrivaled power: the word Roman. This one word establishes the Bishop of Rome alone as the pontiff who wields universal power. With such authority established, the rest make it very difficult for anybody to stand against the Pope. Now, number 3, that he alone can depose or reinstate bishops. Now, this cuts right at the heart of the investiture controversy, which is about to come to peak boil here real soon. With such clear statements as this, it's no wonder Gregory VII will clash head first with the German king, who seems to be the only monarch in Europe who has publicly stood against Gregory on this, at least up to 1075. We know of William in the next year, but at the moment. Now, number 4 states this, that in a council his legate, even if a lower grade, is above all bishops and can pass sentence of deposition against them. Honestly, this one was a bit difficult for me to decipher. I believe this is referring to any priest directly given authority by the Pope himself, be it a messenger or legate. Anyone working on behalf of the Pope who is appointed by the Pope, essentially. If you are working on behalf of the Pope, be it in a council, synod, delegation, whatever, then you're allowed to act as the Pope in that moment when it comes to censoring or passing judgment upon another, even if, as it says, even if that papal legate is of a lower rank than the one being judged. It's the power to deputize, really, in much the same way that Jesus deputized Peter to carry on his teachings. Number 5, that the Pope may depose the absent. Now, this one's kind of obvious, but even Gregory felt it needed to be reasserted. Many of the bishops around Europe weren't even clergy. They were bureaucrats and they were brothers-in-law. I mean, placed in the highest positions of the church by their king as a way to assert control over the power of Rome and to manipulate their people spiritually into doing secular things. Things like, honoring your king is the same as honoring your God. That kind of crap. It led to widespread corruption and oppression, and it, again, hit right at the heart of the investiture controversy. Gregory was making it clear that you didn't need to come to Rome to be removed from your office. He could remove you from anywhere. How? Well, reread the first 3 dictates. See how all this is playing out? And number 6, that, among other things, we ought not to remain in the same house with those excommunicated by him. So here, he is freeing all of those people who feel compelled to go to church. Remember, their bishop, a bishop who was invested with the position from a king, was requiring them to go with promises of spiritual cleansing and whatnot. Gregory is giving these people permission to not attend that church until a new bishop is placed there by the Pope. He's freeing the people from their obligation because, in Gregory's eyes, that obligation is corrupted the moment the bishop was given the position by the king. It's no longer valid. And if you remember, Alexander II had actually null and voided these same bishops who were invested in their positions already. Number 7, that for him alone is it lawful, according to the needs of the time, to make new laws, to assemble together new congregations, to make an abbey of a canonry, and, on the other hand, to divide a rich bishopric and unite the poor ones. Now, the main takeaway here, in my opinion, with number 7, is that the Pope now has the unique power to reorganize Christendom as he sees fit. Now, part of the genius of William's Doomsday Book back up in England was the meticulous accounting of his new kingdom, which yielded him, more or less real data with which to reorganize the place as he saw fit. Will the Pope do the same? At this point in my studies, I really don't know, but it does give the Bishop of Rome the power to do so if he wished. Also, notice he said, quote unquote, to divide a rich bishopric. Why would he want to divide a wealthy, strong, and influential bishopric? Well, it's a way to check the regional power of various bishops, of course. Canterbury, for instance, which will only grow in prestige and influence, and even wealth, over the ensuing centuries. That was one. It was a preemptive strike against any opposition to the Roman bishopric's right as the supreme pontiff over the Western Church. And I should add that even King William I, when he took England over the subsequent 20 years, broke up the Anglo-Saxon earldoms into, smaller areas with different people in charge. Why? To break up the power structures. If you remember, Wessex was massively powerful, and so was Mercia. So it's the same idea that the Pope is pulling together here, only with regional bishoprics. Number 8, that he alone may use the imperial insignia. Now here's a haymaker delivered directly in the jaw of Henry IV. Sorry, Henry. Gregory's the only one who can dare to use the imperial signage. I mean, if the gold rim on the papal tiara shown at the previous year's Lenten Synod wasn't enough, this one seals the deal on Gregory's ultimate aims as Pope. Number 9, that of the Pope alone, all princes shall kiss the feet. Now this one has to be symbolic, but maybe they were kissing the feet. I don't know. It's not my thing. There will be a scene in a couple episodes where this does come into play, but the prostration in front of the Pope, head down, kneeling at the feet of the Pope, is probably what's alluded to here. Either way, it's clear that Gregory's going all in on asserting papal authority over secular rulers as high as kings. 10, that his name alone shall be spoken in the churches. You know what? I'm going to restate this one. I'm going to put emphasis on a certain word. Number 10, that his name alone shall be spoken in the churches. I think that's how it should be read. So the German king and other kings around Europe, to be sure, were venerated in churches each Sunday. Gregory says no more. The Pope's name and the Pope's name alone will receive veneration in masses across Christendom. He's essentially writing out secular rulers from the liturgical proceedings and prayers of each and every congregation across Europe. Number 11, that this is the only name in the world. Okay, he may have overplayed his hand there. Seems a little on the petulant side, but Gregory was not above petulance. I think we've learned that much. He was making his point at the end of each edict less of a period and more of an exclamation point with this one. Number 12, that it may be permitted to him to depose emperors. Oh, snap. Okay, here's where he goes elbow deep in the mess of politics. He's basically saying that if a king becomes emperor, the Pope has the right to get rid of him. Based on what? Well, seen in the entirety of the list thus far, if the emperor fails to uphold papal decrees and goals, well, that's the crime. It's a warning shot across the bow to not only Henry IV, but all future wannabe emperors. Number 13, that he may be permitted to transfer bishops if need be. I think this one is just a reassertion in his ability to reorganize Christendom as he sees fit. I've never been the victim to it yet in my career, but there's a proclivity, at least here, I don't know about elsewhere, there's a proclivity for new principals to a school to, shake things up a bit when they arrive. Grade level teams who've worked together for a while, teams who probably have a smooth process and good rapport with one another, well, they're switched up and they're moved around to new grade levels and new teams. Opinions vary widely on this practice. Detractors say it breaks up teams that are running on all cylinders. Proponents say it breaks up, say, toxic relationships and toxic processes and forces updating and improvement with each team and really each individual. The one undeniable thing for detractors and proponents alike is that it is highly effective in reminding everybody who's actually in charge. So maybe that's what the Pope's going for here. Number 14, that he has the power to ordain a clerk of any church he may wish. I'm unfamiliar with the process of ordaining priests, whether it was prior to these dictates or after, so I apologize for that. Apologize for my ignorance. On its surface, though, it seems that Gregory's simply claiming another privilege as his own. Number 15, that he who is ordained by him may preside over another church, but may not hold a subordinate position, and that such a one may not receive a higher grade from any bishop. This one seems a lot like the investiture that he's claiming to be so against, doesn't it? Kings can no longer place anyone they wish in places of ecclesiastic power, but Numbers 14 and 15 seem like the Pope can. To boot, he proclaims that the right to elevate that person was the Pope's privilege alone. This might seek to keep these people from being corrupted by regional influences like the nobility or other bishops who may not agree with the Pope. Number 16, that no synod shall be called a general one without his order. This is simply declaring that synods were the prerogative of the popes and not kings and emperors, which was the case prior to these dictates. Once again, this seeks to further remove a king's ability to meddle in ecclesiastic affairs. Number 17, that no chapter and no book shall be considered canonical without his authority. This is basically him calling himself the Kathleen Kennedy of the Catholic story. Nothing in Star Wars lore gets added without her approval, just as nothing is added to Catholicism's vast intellectual and spiritual library without the Pope's approval. And if you think about it, this also keeps anyone else making a rival list of dictates to this one and declaring it canon. So it's kind of an insurance policy for what he's writing. Number 18, that a sentence passed by him may be retracted by no one, and that he himself, alone of all, may retract it. That's more of that universal power. But as I said in the last one, it's his insurance that these 27 dictates will stand until a future pope retracts them. What the Pope says is law, period. Number 19, that he himself may be judged by no one. Now today, we champion the idea that no one is above the law. It's not always true in practice, unfortunately, but we do hold it as a core Western principle. However, he's masterfully set this up. See, if you pass judgment on the Pope, and if the Pope, as he said in the first two of these dictates, and the Pope is God's representative on earth, endowed with universal authority, then what you're doing is passing judgment on God himself. Remember what I said at the top of the episode about the Thomas theorem? It bears repeating. If men define situations as real, then they are real in their consequences. Medieval Europeans, largely, were deeply spiritual people. Even the kings and nobility. They believed God was real, so they believed the consequences of a real God. We can't understand medieval history without understanding that. If the Pope was correct, then these consequences would have dire effects on their afterlife. And make no mistake, folks, like we do today, whether Christian or not, what happens after death is a central part of our lives, whether we're acutely aware of it. Our medieval ancestors may have held this even higher on their priorities than we do today. The consequences of challenging the Pope's authority just became one that could affect their relationship with God and thus their eternal soul's fate. That's a heavy one. Number 20, that no one shall dare to condemn one who appeals to the apostolic chair. In this one, we see the stirrings of judicial ideas such as double jeopardy and the final say of the Supreme Court, at least here in the U.S. If the Pope declares a ruling on something, others cannot bring that person up on the same crime or attempt to overturn the Pope's ruling. What the Pope says is final. Why? Because it's God's ultimate judgment. Number 21, that to the latter should be referred the more important cases of every church. Here, Gregory's inserting himself into local affairs of each church much more than in the past. If a church comes to an impasse, then it heads to the regional bishopric. If that still leads to an impasse, then the Pope is given the case to deliberate. This is pretty exact to the way our federal and state courts work here in the States, but it once again declares the Pope's word as final. 22. That the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, the Scripture bearing witness. See what he did there? He further established the Catholic Church as the direct descendant of Jesus' teachings, granted to humanity by God directly. Therefore, if God is infallible, then so is the Church. I get it. But to say that the Church is made up of naturally fallible people, and then turn right around and say the Church itself is infallible, when the fallible people are running the thing, I just don't know. Churches are for sinners, not saints, in my opinion. Saints really have no need of a church. Number 23. That the Roman pontiff, if he has been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made a saint by the merits of St. Peter, St. Ennodius, Bishop of Pavia, bearing witness, and many holy fathers agreeing with him, as is contained in the decrees of St. Symmachus the Pope. Now this one takes a little unpacking, but it's not terribly complex. Essentially, Gregory is reasserting the fact that the Pope is directly linked to St. Peter, the first bishop of Rome. Therefore, just as Peter was made a saint, so too shall the Pope be automatically assumed a saint. John Julius Norwich, in his book Absolute Monarchs, says it this way, quote, "These dictates included the assertion that all popes are by definition saints, inheriting their sanctity from St. Peter, a theory which must have raised a few eyebrows among Gregory's older contemporaries." End quote. And the name-dropping of St. Ennodius and St. Symmachus is simply Gregory listing the intellectual ancestors of this idea of making popes saints in the vein of St. Peter. St. Ennodius was never pope, but St. Symmachus was. But I feel like he is laying the groundwork and paving the way for his own posthumous sainthood. And since the Pope declared it, then it couldn't possibly be wrong, right? He's already established that. Number 24, that by his commanded consent it may be lawful for the subordinates to bring accusations. This is merely more of Gregory deputizing anyone he wishes to act on his behalf. And if you take the never has erred from Dictate 22, then he may be doubling down on things in the past. Dare I say, the papal legate Frederick of Lorraine's barging into the Hagia Sophia during Sunday Mass and slamming Pope Leo IX's papal bull excommunicating Patriarch Michael Cerularius back in 1054. In light of his possible upcoming crusade, this dictate could be used and manipulated to declare his supremacy once he arrived in Constantinople at the head of the Western Army. But that's just my supposition. But I can't see how it couldn't have played into the dictate being included. Remember, Gregory VII has played the long game for over 20 years. This could be simply a Hail Mary to a future Gregory VII or a future pope entirely. Almost there. Number 25, that he may depose and reinstate bishops without assembling a synod. And here's where we really see the corruption showing through. Things that happen behind closed doors are rarely, if ever, in the best interest of those they affect. By not having to be accountable to anyone else, even in a gathering of peers and subordinates, well, that's setting a dangerous precedent.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
26. That he who is not at peace with the Roman Church shall not be considered Catholic. Ouch. Yeah, so basically, if we ain't copacetic, then you ain't Catholic. But what does that mean? So the word Catholic was originally used as just a lowercase c adjective to describe the church, not a follower of the church. In fact, lower c Catholic, is how it was according to the translation of these dictates that I'm pulling from. So is lower c. Now it's derived from the Greek word katholikos, meaning universal or pertaining to the whole. The church given to Simon Peter by Jesus encapsulated the entirety of Jesus' teachings, so the thinking goes. After the Great Schism of 1054, this idea of lowercase c Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodoxy became more and more prominent as the centuries went on. Essentially, Gregory was saying that you can be Christian if you want to, but you still don't have the blessing of the church to make it to heaven. And again, I'm reminded of the Thomas theorem. It doesn't matter what I think, it matters what they thought. And this was big. It's why excommunication was so powerful to secular rulers to bend to the Pope's demands in the end. Now, 27, the last one. That he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. And the last dictate piggybacks off of almost every dictate that came before it. At the end of the day, the Pope can declare any person wicked and then give their subordinates, including the peasants, the ability and spiritual permission to deny their rule if necessary. And if you don't have Gregory's growing animosity with the German crown in mind right now, I suggest that this would be a good time to put it there. So there you have it. Gregory VII's 27 dictates of the Pope, or Dictatus Papae, were the cornerstone for his papacy, and they wouldn't soon be forgotten by future popes either. In fact, it sets the stage for centuries of growing papal supremacy beyond ecclesiastical affairs and directly into the political arena. And these consequences would begin immediately, right then in 1075. I quoted Spike earlier, and her words bear repeating. Quote, Gregory decisively declared war against lay interests of the world. End quote. However, she continues that quote with this. She says, his precepts freed the laity from the feudal shackles of class and wealth by insisting that the church was the sole arbiter of universal justice. All men, Gregory said, are equal in the eyes of God. Which, she says, included the king. This was again truly the first of the great revolutions of Western history. Gregory VII is listed as one of the most impactful popes in history, and I hope I've done a good job getting this point across. His story is not even done. To think we've only just entered his second year as pontiff. He has another decade to go, at least. Now we're going to stick to the Mediterranean for the duration of this bend in the narrative. So many more episodes in the Mediterranean region. A narrative that encompasses the Normans taking full control of the southern half of the Boot, as well as Sicily. A narrative that seeks to showcase Pope Gregory VII in the light he deserves, for better or for worse. A narrative that highlights one of the more powerful and influential women throughout all medieval history, in Matilda of Tuscany. A narrative that will show Guiscard making a play on the Byzantine crown. Spoiler alert there. But before we get out of here, it's worth noting one of the more notable reactions to Gregory VII's 27 dictates, and we find it in another pesky Norman, King William I of England. See, in direct opposition to Gregory, William, the next year in 1076, declared that the English church would remain English insofar that English kings would dictate who runs the church, not some far-off pope in Rome. It wasn't quite the declaration of King Henry VIII more than 4 centuries later, but it's another one of those acts that set the historical precedent for things to come after it. Now, in the next episode, we zoom back in on the effects of these dictates. And they're not going to be very pretty. And I can't wait to tell you about it.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.